Hello, and welcome to the final episode of Finding a Founder. Today, we round off the series by examining Benjamin Franklin's role in the key moments that led to the American Revolutionary War and his eventual signing of the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776. Today, I am once again joined by historian and author George Goodwin, who has served as the Benjamin Franklin House Author in Residence since 2015. He's also the author of Benjamin Franklin in London and has a new book coming out this year titled Propaganda Wars of the American Revolution. George Goodwin, welcome back.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be back, and it's always nice to be invited again.
So, last episode, we talked a bit more about Franklin's social life, about his love of London, and it was overall quite a joyous reflection on Franklin's time. But this episode is going to be a slightly more serious, I would say, in terms of what we talk about. As we discussed previously, Franklin was living in London from 1757 through to 1775 and left on the very eve of the Revolutionary War. But during that time, some of the key moments that led to the revolution itself occurred, and what we're going to be looking at is the British perspective of that. Franklin, obviously living in London, was operating on the British side of things. And we're going to be talking about key moments such as the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, and eventually the reason why Franklin had to leave London, arguably against his will. So, George, let's go all the way back. I wonder if you could very quickly just summarize what had happened to Franklin between 1757 and 1765, and then we'll talk about the Stamp Act.
Well, looking at it politically, I mean, almost from the moment he arrived, he was writing. He was writing for the newspapers or for pamphlets for publication, and he had a mature perspective that not only covered his own adopted colony of Pennsylvania, but he actually had a thorough view of the colonies as an entity in general. He had traveled widely in America. I mean, again, as I said before, he was deputy postmaster for North America. And when he'd been in North America, he had traveled widely because he had been redesigning the postal routes in order to make them far more efficient. So, I mean, he'd been to a great number of colonies along the seaboard, getting the views of people there, as well as at his home base in Pennsylvania. So he regarded himself as not only representing Pennsylvania, but the colonies in general. And specifically, he did actually become the representative in London for other colonies other than Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Georgia, for instance, and Massachusetts particularly. And that made him desirous of representing them to the people in power and to in government particularly, and also in Parliament. So from the moment he arrived, he was writing, as I said. I mean, for instance, he wrote The Interest of Great Britain Considered, and that dealt with how Britain should deal with Canada, for instance, how it should be extended. This was in the middle of the 7 Years' War, and so writing in 1759, 1760, when Canada had been conquered, he was looking at how it could be introduced into the empire to the benefit of Britain. Britain taking in terms not only the British Isles, but Britain in general, because his view was that the colonies should be regarded as like counties joined to Britain, should be treated as very much on a par with Britain itself. So he was writing, and he was also meeting people. I mean, for instance, he was one of the, back to the Stamp Act in 1765, he was one of the representatives who actually met George Grenville, the Prime Minister, to discuss ways in which the American colonies could contribute to funding their own defense. And people in Britain thought, right, okay, that's understandable because we've had a Stamp Act here until 1712. And so how the Stamp Act worked was that everything of paper and some other things would pay a tax. It would carry a stamp, and that you would pay a tax for it. So, and the fact they carried a stamp meant that you had paid the tax. So it was a way of guaranteeing revenue. However, the problem was not so much the idea of the tax in financial terms, it was the fact it cut across the charters of the American colonies, that they were responsible for their own internal taxation. Franklin actually thought that it was understandable, and to begin with, he backed the idea, and he even recommended a friend of his, John Hughes, to be one of the collectors. And for once, he was completely out of sympathy for how they actually felt in America themselves. This was shown pretty forcibly by the fact that his own house and Deborah had to be protected from a likely riot, an attack. And attacks at the time on houses could be extremely consequential. I mean, for instance, Thomas Hutchinson had his house destroyed. So that he then, with letters back, it was made clear to him that this was actually an extremely bad idea.
Is it quite surprising that Franklin was initially supportive of the Stamp Act, coming from a printing background and being aware of how important things like paper, for example, were to those businesses, and now they had to pay an additional tax to keep themselves going?
Well, it was actually, it was kind of like a blind spot because, you know, being a newspaper journalist and proprietor, you would have thought, now this is actually not going to work very well politically over there, because it may be accepted in Britain, but over there, newspapers, of course, came out against it because of the idea of it was against the colonial charters, and they led the attack on the tax, and they were actually able to organize mass opposition, including rioting, against it.
And so, following the riots, Franklin very quickly realizes that actually maybe the Stamp Act is not the best way to approach raising funds. Is it fair to say, in response to the cost of the 7 Years' War, this is one of the reasons why the Stamp Act was brought about?
Oh, yes, absolutely, because, Britain had been highly successful militarily in the 7 Years' War. It had established a dominance in the Caribbean, which was incredibly important politically, because that's where the sugar came from, and the whole of the British nation was hooked on sugar. If they'd lost the sugar from the colonies, which they could have done if they'd lost, there would have been riots in the street. So that was one important. The other thing was the fact that they gained Canada, and hence Canadian massive resources of Canada in terms of wood, for instance, for the fleet, and other supplies. So Canada was extremely important. And also the fact that they gained Canada meant that their American colonies couldn't be attacked from the north by the French. So it was an incredibly important game, but it cost a phenomenal amount of money. The national debt doubled as a result of the war. And the key thing was that, Britain could accept the past expenditure, but they wanted to keep the British Army in America because, of course, they'd taken Canada, but there were other parts of America which were still, for instance, Louisiana, a vast area which was still run by the French, and Florida, though the British had taken part of it. It was still under threat from the Spanish, so that they still had footholds, or more than footholds, great territories in America which needed to be defended. And they expected the Americans to contribute to that. But they introduced means of doing so, which, as I said, completely cut across the Americans' idea of their own self-government.
How did Franklin sort of turn around on this? What did he do to eventually help get the act repealed?
Well, Grenville's government fell. Now, the king actually acted unconstitutionally. He sacked him. I mean, the whole point of the constitutional monarchy was that the king, the rule was through the king in parliament, which meant that the prime minister serving the king should be able to command a majority in parliament. Grenville could command a majority in parliament at the time, but the king found Grenville's patronizing approach to himself, and also the fact that he'd sold area outside Buckingham Palace, which was then built on, and he and his family could be seen walking around the gardens of Buckingham Palace, which is an absolute disgrace. So got rid of Grenville, and then turned to Rockingham, who could commanded a majority. And Rockingham actually was far more liberal towards America. And after some time, he introduced the repeal of the Stamp Act, and they had a meeting of the committee of the House of Commons, of the whole House of Commons, and they took took statements and an answer of questions from various experts, and chief amongst them was one Benjamin Franklin.
And is it fair to say that from that point on, Franklin's role becomes arguably as representative of the colonies, their interests, their sentiments, and as a sort of an advisor to the British government on their behalf?
He was when he could be. I mean, the Rockingham, he had a rather rocky, no pun intended, a rocky command of Parliament, and he lost it. And then, glory of glory, the man that the king had wanted to become his prime minister all along, the man who'd actually won the 7 Years' War, as Secretary of State for War, effectively, who was William Pitt, now Earl of Chatham, the great commoner, had actually taken the title, but never mind, became prime minister at last. Unfortunately, very soon after taking over, he had a nervous breakdown and disappeared to Bath, leaving the Duke of Grafton to be sort of acting and then full-time prime minister, which takes us from 1766 to 70. And he had access to Grafton. In fact, Grafton almost offered him a job, except Grafton was, by that time, which was 1769, his command was of affairs in general was dodgy in the least. And he then, for various reasons, he actually brought in the right wing, very, very anti-American Bedfordites, followers of the Duke of Bedford, into government, and all changed. But we should also mention that because Grafton's own, he was very young, his sort of grip on affairs was very, very slack. His Chancellor of the Exchequer, against cabinet policy, introduced the acts that bear his name, the Townshend duties, which was another taxation against the charters, which was the tax on paper, paint, and most importantly, as it would turn out, tea. And having introduced that, Townshend then he died. He got a disease and died shortly afterwards. But again, that was completely against the charters of the Americans. So a major problem.
So the Stamp Act had been repealed, but effectively not too long after was replaced by another form of taxation that was not popular with the colonists.
Yeah.
And in 1770, there is a moment in Massachusetts, the Boston Massacre, which we talked about in the very first episode. Certainly in Boston, the massacre had quite a considerable impact, but was it reported on in Great Britain? What was the word on the street in London following this perceived conflict?
Well, Franklin predicted the massacre. Extraordinarily enough, in a letter of the 18th of March, i.e. far too soon for news of the massacre to have reached him, he predicted it. And it's an extraordinary letter written to Charles Charles Thompson, he not only predicted the massacre, but he actually set down the problem of British governance, if you like, which would lead to the breach in 1775, which he spent his time trying to actually, trying to prevent. So he said, again, of the Duke of Grafton and Lord North, who was had taken over from Townshend as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He said, but though both the Duke of Grafton and Lord North were, and are, in my opinion, rather inclined to satisfy us, i.e., to listen to the colonial protests, yet the Bedford party are so violent against us and so prevalent in the council that more moderate measures could not take place. This party never speak of us, but with evident malice. Rebels and traitors are the best names they can afford us, and I believe they only wish for a colourable pretence and occasion of ordering the soldiers to make a massacre among us. And that had happened on the 5th of March. The reason being, because of the previous protests in Boston, British troops had been brought in to prevent supposedly any uprising or riot. But of course, they actually created it because troops who were sort of crammed together, who were not actually doing anything much, except in some cases taking jobs locally, they were walking around the street, being drunk, starting fights. And in fact, Franklin knew all about this because his sister Jane, or called Jenny, would write to him, saying the appalling behaviour of these soldiers in the streets. The people were frightened to go out, except there were some who were quite keen to go out for a bit of a fight with the soldiers. And this led to an incident outside the customs house in Boston, where a nervous young soldier fired at people attacking him. Other soldiers came together, and again there was chaos, and they were having it was very snowy on the ground. It started off with having snowballs thrown at them, but it came rather more serious than that. They were having staves thrown at them, and another gun went off. That led to a collective fire, and a number of the Bostonians were killed. I mean, these were quite a lot of them were sailors or navvies. They were not the members of the bourgeoisie that were presented in an engraving by Paul Revere, because in the engraving they weren't in workman's clothes at all. They were dressed as members of the bourgeoisie. It was an amazing propaganda approach, as was commissioned by Samuel Adams. It was came out very, very quickly and published by Eads and Gill, who were the publishers of the Boston Gazette and had basically ridiculed and brought down two royal governors. And it talked about the horrid massacre in Boston. That was before there was any trial of the soldiers responsible. And months later, and it took months later for things to calm down, when it came to trial, the John Adams and Josiah Quincy, both radicals, they acted as lawyers, and in fact the soldiers were not exactly let off, but I think one served a short sentence, and it was really regarded as being they had been provoked, and it all was a sort of massive accident. However, the key thing is that it would be referred to as the massacre.
You mentioned earlier that there would be a Tea Act. Let's move forward a little bit in time. So we've had the Boston Massacre. Things are very tense in the colonies, especially in Massachusetts. We have British troops causing a ruckus in the streets. But let's talk about the Tea Act and the impact of that, and also the repercussions as well.
Well, the Tea Act came into it came into force because it was to help out the East India Company, strangely. Now, with the Navigation Acts, the whole point was that everything came from the empire. Even if it was going to go to other parts of the empire, it all had to come into London first and be re-exported from there. But because the East India Company was having a problem, it was decided that it would save the company, which with tea being an incredibly important part of the financing of the East India Company if it went direct to America. And what they did was they reduced the price of tea by so doing. That was all should have been all well and good, because the idea was there was so much foreign tea coming into America because it was cheaper. And now the British tea from the East India Company was now cheaper. So surely everybody would want to buy the tea. One problem, they put a tax on it. And that was, again, the whole point, yet again, of cutting across the American colonies' right to introduce their own internal taxation. Now, it could be argued, oh, well, this was customs, but it was still affected the American colonists. And I mean, Franklin just thought it was just a completely ludicrous thing to do. I mean, that it made sense as far as the East India Company was concerned to directly export to America. But the idea of putting this tax on it as well was just repeating exactly the same mistake as before.
And so how did the colonists eventually respond to this repeated situation of a new taxation without representation, as it were?
Well, the Boston Tea Party could actually have happened in New York. It happened in Boston. There was a double problem. Not only was there a focus on what the British government was doing, but there was also the problem of the fact that Governor Hutchinson, who was a Bostonian himself, he was seen to be profiting from the importation of tea with its tax, because his sons were amongst the merchants who were importing it. So that gave another reason why there should be a massive uprising against the tea. And what happened was that a group of radicals got together and pretended to be Mohawk Indians, rather badly disguised as Mohawk Indians, but they went directly to the ships which had been allowed by Hutchinson to go into the harbour. In the case of New York, they didn't, so there wasn't a problem. They went into the harbour, and the Mohawks went on board and tipped all the tea into the harbour. And this was seen by the British government as a step too far. Actually, it was seen by Americans as very unfortunate, to the extent that Franklin, when he heard about it, he offered to recompense the merchants for their losses at having lost the tea. I mean, it would have ruined him. But, you know, he was so keen, as part of his trying to bring a solution, he saw that. And George Washington, he was very sort of radical by this point. I mean, he was extremely critical of the British government. But even he said there was a mistake about the tea. They shouldn't have done it, because it brought a vast number of new acts of repression against Boston in the form of the Coercive and Intolerable Acts. Two names for the same thing. Coercive because it was against the institutions of government of Massachusetts, and intolerable because it was intolerable for that reason.
So the Tea Party was actually something that Franklin, along with many other prominent Americans, felt, as you said, was a step too far. And the British, in response, introduced what are now known as the Coercive or the Intolerable Acts. I wonder if you could give us a couple of examples of these acts and why they would be so invasive as well, especially for the people of Massachusetts.
Well, that's very well put, because invasive is the word. First off was the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston, therefore suspending all trade in and out. Then there was the Massachusetts Government Act, and that actually suspended elections. It suspended the House of Representatives, and the colony was governed by, or attempted to be governed by, what were called mandamus councillors, who were Crown appointed. And it also allowed the governor himself to appoint judges and to restrict town meetings. So effectively, all the institutions of government were suspended. And guess what? It was unenforceable. So the Massachusetts radicals themselves created their own ways of governing in reaction. But there were other things on top. There was the Quartering Act, where soldiers were actually, before that they had been quartered in warehouse, not very comfortably, in sort of converted warehouses and in barracks. They had they were now going to be quartered on the inhabitants, and the inhabitants were expected to pay for them. Then there was the Impartial Administration of Justice Act, which is really sort of total 1984 stuff, because it was hardly impartial. It allowed the governor to move the colonists' legal actions against royal officials to Britain itself. So again, it was another suspension. And then finally, there was the Quebec Act, which affected not only Massachusetts, but also all the colonies, and particularly people like Washington, who had land across the frontier, which was now going to be given to Canada, the whole of the Ohio Valley, amazingly. And of course, their land rights were going to be lost. And there are other things. I mean, there was, bearing in mind the religion of nonconformist religion of New England, they were going to be allowed to have Catholic bishops in Canada to keep the Canadian citizens happy. But it was all seen to be acting against the interests of Massachusetts, New England, and of course, the idea, as expressed by John Jay at the First Continental Congress, which was called as a response to the Coercive Acts, well, if they do it to Massachusetts, they're going to do it to us all. So it was really they got to the stage where, unless something desperate was done, there was going to be an organized outbreak of violence on a military level between the colonies and Britain at home. How did Franklin react to this? Well, he tried desperately to come to some kind of solution. He opened negotiations with Lord North, the Prime Minister, and they got nowhere. They really got nowhere because the government was not happy to negotiate at all. Their approach, with the support of the House of Commons, because the House of Commons, they had a majority because the parliamentarians were completely opposed to the idea that these colonists, who were sort of treated as naughty children, were being mutinous against British government acts. So Franklin tried his hardest. He tried his hardest to the very moment that when he had to board ship, because it was likely that he was going to be arrested by the government as a result of having leaked some letters which incriminated Governor Hutchinson and his Lieutenant Governor Oliver in actions which were regarded by the colonists as being completely unconstitutional and being directed at establishing a governmental tyranny in Massachusetts.
Very quickly, before we talk about Franklin leaving London and the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, I wonder if we could talk a bit more about the Hutchinson affair. And it's worth saying as well that following the Tea Party, what we've just talked about largely occurred in 1774.
Yes.
Franklin would eventually leave in March 1775. So let's talk about those final 18 months of his time in London. What were these papers that he leaked? Why was he essentially a fugitive almost? And how was he chased out of London?
Well, I'm going to actually disagree with the word fugitive. Well, he was fugitive at the end, at the very, very end. So we're talking about the last few days. But before that, he very much wasn't. I mean, all these societies, even the Royal Society, right until the very end, they were apolitical, and he was welcomed. He was completely welcomed. However, let's talk about what happened with the Hutchinson affair and how it coincided with the report of the Boston Tea Party, and it led to a disagreement amongst historians, and we don't like disagreements amongst historians about how it actually affected him. What happened was that Hutchinson and Oliver had written letters to somebody called Thomas Whately, who was very close to George Grenville. These were letters which were critical of the way that the radical opposition was behaving in Massachusetts. And they had some very dangerous phrases, if you like, uttered in anger or written in anger, but obviously uttered in anger first, which pointed to the idea that they actually wanted to do what, of course, the Coercive Acts did do. And these were written, I mean, some time before. We are talking about, going back a little bit, we are talking about 1772, 1773. They looked as if, or they were interpreted as looking towards suspending the House of Representatives and introducing, as I said before, the idea of a tyrannous rule by Hutchinson over Massachusetts. Now, how he got hold of these letters is that the letters, Thomas Whately had died, and they were in the possession of his brother, William Whately. And William Whately was obviously suspected as one of the people who had leaked the letters to someone. And there was another person, John Temple, was another person who was suspected because, according to William Whately, because Whately had actually showed Temple the letters. John Temple, by the way, was the son-in-law of James Bowdoin, who was the man who'd effectively taken over the governor's council, so that the governor's council, instead of acting with the governor Hutchinson, was very much against it. So he had a reason as well. Now, they didn't actually, they weren't responsible for passing on these letters to somebody who, it was unknown who had actually sent these letters to the newspapers, but they suspected each other. The person was probably Thomas Pownall, who hated Hutchinson and was a previous governor. But we'll put that to one side. Because Temple and Whately suspected the other, they had a duel. And they were completely hopeless at the duel. I mean, they fired pistols and they went sort of all over the place and they were sort of scrabbled around in the mud. So badly, in fact, I think one got a bit of a scratch. They decided to have another go. At which point, Franklin thought it was right to prevent the further problems and the likely death of one of them, because they might actually have got their act together. On Christmas Day, he wrote to the newspaper saying, yes, he was the person who had sent the letters over to Boston to be not to be published, actually, just to be given to his friend Thomas Cushing, who was one of the representatives, and shown to people, but not actually published. What Franklin wanted to get across, that the problem was with Hutchinson, it wasn't actually with the British government. It was still possible, he hoped, that the Bedfordites would be booted out, that Chatham and or Rockingham, the problem was that the two liberal groups, if you like, had they got together, as they did actually at the end of the war, then they would have taken over the government and there might have been a solution. And that was what Franklin was counting on. Unfortunately, the two lots absolutely loathed each other, so it wasn't possible. So he was hoping that, as I said, that Samuel Adams and others, once shown the letters, would say, okay, well, it is all Hutchinson, and perhaps the British government is not so bad after all. But in doing that, Franklin disobeyed one of his own great principles that he wrote years before in his Poor Richard almanac, which was, 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. And in this case, unfortunately, Cushing showed the letters, but Adams absolutely insisted that they should be published in the newspapers. And so they were. Massive upset at home. Franklin put his hand up. So that was serious, but not as serious as what happened next. Was that Franklin had asked to petition the Privy Council, which is basically the sort of the greater government, if you like, that Hutchinson should be removed, should be recalled to Britain, though, of course, he was a Bostonian, but basically to be kicked out of Massachusetts and replaced. And so the hearing was going to be held in January 1774. And that was exactly the time when the letters were published, and also the report of the Boston Tea Party arrived. And he was verbally assaulted by the Attorney General, Sir Alexander Wedderburn, over 40 minutes. It was actually quite a sport for the Privy Council. You know, people like the Archbishop of Canterbury and Bishop of London were there to see it. Now, this is the moment when historians, some historians believe that Franklin turned his back on Britain because he was completely humiliated. Not true, in my opinion. He came out of this haranguing and talked to Priestley, and basically he kind of just said, "Oh well, you know, so be it." He did lose his role at the post office, and so that was a financial loss. But in terms of him turning his back on Britain, he certainly didn't.
So what was the moment where he did have to leave the city? Was there a particular...
Yes, there was a particular moment in early March 1775 when Whately, having found out that Franklin was responsible for leaking these letters, put out an order through a court, or gained a court order for Franklin's arrest. But also there was a likelihood that the government were preparing to try and arrest him as well, that the Duke of Suffolk, who was one of the government ministers who particularly wanted to bring Franklin to book, that he was preparing to arrest Franklin as well. And there's this rather touching scene recorded by Joseph Priestley of, you know, the day before Franklin left, of him meeting Franklin at Benjamin Franklin House and reading through the newspapers that had come over from America, and of all from particularly those from his birthplace of Boston, you know, recording all these sort of the chaos and the attempt of the government to enforce the Coercive Acts. You know, it was against everything that Franklin stood for, and he had tears running down his face as he was reading and being read extracts from the papers. And then the next day he caught ship for America. And I go slightly further, I think, than a number of other historians in saying that was the moment when Franklin decided that all was lost and that he turned from being a Briton to being American. And he wrote, it was a long, long letter to his son William, a letter of 20,000 words, so sort of more than a letter really, explaining what had happened. It was almost, he was acting on the approach of his own prudential algebra, where he'd something that he'd come up with years and years before, where he, in order to decide a point, that he would put on one side all the pros and on the other all the cons. It's quite a good way of actually managing your life. And then he would sort of go away, think about it, and start ticking them off. And when one had become dominant, he would decide that was the course of action. And I think it was almost as simple as that. He sort of he arrived back in America, had a meeting with son William and with Joseph Galloway, who had been Benjamin Franklin's supporter as the Speaker of the Assembly of Pennsylvania. And they sat down, and it soon became clear, both to William and to Galloway, that Franklin now had become a radical and supported the American cause, when in fact they were and would remain active loyalists. So that was one breach. However, one would have thought that Franklin would have been regarded with admiration as soon as he turned up at the Second Continental Congress. But actually there was an initial suspicion amongst many, thinking, well, you know, he has been in Britain itself for quite a long time. Can we count on him? How do we know that he's actually not going to be on our side? But he made this extremely clear quite quickly, He was quite quiet to begin with, but very soon he had actually established himself as the key figure on two crucial committees. One was the Secret Committee, which was to provide support and supplies for the American privateers that were attacking British shipping. And the other was the Secret Committee of Correspondence. And the plan of that was to try and gain as much support for the American cause from wherever it might come, which of course meant from the likes of Britain's official enemies, France and Spain. And of course, France and Spain, as I said, did have their interests in America, which they wanted to protect. And things, of course, sharpened up further in early 1776, when the proclamation of the king arrived, and also, more importantly, his speech to Parliament, when he showed that he was very much on the side of the government. He had been seen as, the father of Americans, as Britons, in the same way as he was the father of Britons in Britain itself. And he was now seen to be somebody who actually wanted to punish his subjects rather than be their protector. That was one thing. And of course, news of the speech to Parliament came at exactly the same time as Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which was an extraordinarily impactful publication because aside from its insult towards the king, which was not necessarily taken on board, it did say that the two countries should become independent of one another. That really, the idea of being independent had really not taken hold again, but over the next few months, it did. In fact, Common Sense was so well written, people actually thought it had been written by Benjamin Franklin, not by this unknown Thomas Paine, who just come over from England.
And what about the Declaration of Independence? How exactly did Benjamin Franklin get involved?
He was one of the people who was chosen to work on the Declaration of Independence um it had been decided after various other events in early 1776 that they should look towards the Declaration. And again, it was thought that Franklin must have written it. It was so well written. But as it was found out later, that it was actually the work chiefly of Thomas Jefferson. Franklin did offer one or two actually changes which were important, but it was basically Jefferson's work. And the reason that it was not publicly known that Jefferson was the author was because the debates in Congress were actually secret. So that was the reason why it was, if you like, misattributed.
And what did Benjamin Franklin do after the 4th of July?
Well, his role continued. He was the person seen to be the best person to go and represent Congress in France, because the Silas Deane, who had been the first representative to the French, had not been so effective as they would have liked at getting money and support out of the French government. It was thought that Franklin was the one to go. So it almost kind of bookends the way that Franklin had arrived in Britain in 1757 from America to work for American interests in Britain, going over at the end of 1776 to France. He was doing the absolute opposite in a sense. He was trying to work against the interests of Britain by working with and through their traditional enemy, that is France.
250 years later, we are celebrating American independence, the American Revolution, and Franklin's role, as we've heard across all the episodes of this series, especially today, the role that Franklin had in that eventual independence movement. I think that's a nice place to sort of wrap things up a little bit. But before we do that, it'd be good to reflect on, I think, Franklin's time in London It's a period that's often overlooked in discussions about Franklin's life. But I think we've heard a lot from you, George, about certainly the love of the city that Franklin had, but also the impact it had on Franklin as an individual as well. And I think it'd be good to talk perhaps first about what were some of Franklin's key achievements in this 17-year period that he lived and worked in London. What was the main takeaway from his time in London, his main success?
I would say it's quite simple. He achieved his own personal potential. I mean, he was accepted. He was a provincial in America, but when he came to Britain, he was very much a Briton, and he accepted in top society in Britain, because, as I said, he was this equivalent of a Nobel Prize winner in a city and amongst a class, the aristocracy, the governing class, who were extremely keen on science. And so scientists were very welcoming to Franklin, but so was the aristocracy. I mean, they come and visit him at Benjamin Franklin House. I mean, to see him, he had a special machine which would create a 9-inch flame for their amusement through sort of his experiments with electricity. I'm not quite sure how Mrs. Stevenson liked that, but he loved it in Britain, and he became the Franklin that he wanted to be, if you like, and he would have stayed in Britain had there been a political solution. I don't think there's any doubt about that, because in fact he wrote to William saying that Britain, and particularly Scotland, he was very fond of Scotland, he would have been happier to have spent the rest of his days in Britain. He did actually say in writing to William that please don't tell your mother this, but that was something that he firmly believed. But of course, once he went back to America, he was very much, as they call it, the first American.
You mentioned Benjamin Franklin House. I think to close this episode, we've both sort of represented the house in the last 2 episodes. It's the only residence of Franklin that remains standing to this day. What do you think Franklin, if he was resurrected tomorrow, what would he make of his legacy being remembered fondly in London after he was essentially chased out of the city 250 years ago?
Well, not as fondly remembered or remembered at all as it should be. I mean, thank goodness for Benjamin Franklin House, because it's a starting point for getting Franklin's time in London far better known. And actually, I mean, some authors, of course, myself with my Benjamin Franklin in London, but a number of others have been writing about Franklin's time in London. So as time goes on with those writings, and most importantly, with the work that Benjamin Franklin House itself does, his time there is getting better known.
And you mentioned that, of course, you are the author of Benjamin Franklin in London, and you're coming out with a new book in 2026 as part of this celebratory year. Is that correct?
It is indeed. Yes, it's published in America. It's published by Yale, both in America and here. And it's called The Propaganda Wars of the American Revolution. And as I only briefly, I mean, Eden Gill of the Boston Gazette got a brief mention in our talk, but it shows the incredible importance of propaganda in the destroying the reputations of the 2 governors of Massachusetts during the 1760s into the 1770s, but also more widely how, for instance, opposition to the Stamp Act was completely coordinated by newspapers using each other's material, and that's why opposition went down the Atlantic seaboard like wildfire, because they were reporting each other's events. So it was extraordinarily important. And also during the war, Washington became the symbolic leader of the American Revolution as well as the military one. And even during the New York campaign, when which actually publication over here is in late August, when the New York campaign began, or 250th anniversary of the New York campaign. He lost battle after battle. You wouldn't have known it, because the great retreats were always the things that were celebrated. And the key thing was that he was able to get the army away and survived. So that's why I'm actually bringing it out at that point, because it's a key moment. It's when Britain should have won the war and they just threw it away. And the fact that Washington was able to survive, partly due to his representation in the newspapers, which prevented the total collapse of morale, which would have ended the American cause. And as I said, partly through British mistakes. Everything would have been different without propaganda.
So if you're interested in reading more from George Goodwin, you can either check out his previous book, Benjamin Franklin in London, or wait for his new one to come out in stores later this year. So all that's left to say at this point is thank you very much to George Goodwin for talking to us today about Benjamin Franklin and the American Revolution.
Thank you very much indeed, Henry. I've much enjoyed it.
And with that, we bring Finding a Founder to a close. Over the course of the last 8 episodes, we've talked about the life and times of Benjamin Franklin from birth to revolution. And I'd like to thank all the sites who participated in the series. Our Boston sites were the Old State House, the Old South Meeting House, and the Boston Latin School. Our Philadelphia sites were the University of Pennsylvania, the American Philosophical Society, and the Library Company of Philadelphia. Our London site was, of course, Benjamin Franklin House. And lastly, thank you for listening. Hopefully you'll come visit one of the sites or all of the sites who took part in making Finding a Founder possible. Until then, thanks again and goodbye.